My name is Yoram Bauman. I appear before you this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, as the world's first and only stand-up economist. I'd like to give you some examples of economics comedy. And I want to start with this little piece that I've done called When Life Gives You Lemons. So everybody's familiar with this classic phrase, when life gives you lemons, you should make lemonade. But there's a band called Fly Moon Royalty, and they have a song called Lemonade that has some lyrics that have kind of a nice capitalist twist on this phrase. So the lyrics are, when life gives you lemons, you can go and build a lemonade stand, sell it for $1.50, guaranteed to put a little cash in hand. And I thought that it was kind of a neat way to describe capitalism. And I thought, what else could we explain in economics using variations on this phrase, when life gives you lemons? So for example, we could compare going to business school and getting an MBA with going to graduate school in economics. So when you get an MBA, when life gives you lemons, you should go and corner the market for lemons. When you go to economics graduate school, when life gives you lemons, you should go and read The Market for Lemons, the Nobel Prize-winning paper by George Akerlof. Microeconomics, when life gives you lemons, you should consider a world with only two goods, lemons and everything else. Show the budget constraint shifting so that you can reach a higher indifference curve. The extra credit question here is, what happens if lemons are a bad rather than a good? In macroeconomics, when life gives you lemons, you should show the impacts using an ISLM model. And the extra credit here is to come up with clever terminology that allows you to call it an ISLM model. Milton Friedman has what you may know as the permanent income hypothesis related to the permanent lemon hypothesis. That says that when life gives you lemons, you should make lemonade, but don't drink all of it right away. Instead, you should increase your consumption of lemonade a little bit every day for the rest of your life. Development economics, when life gives you lemons, you should find 50 similar villages in Kenya. You should randomly divide them into two groups and give lemons to one of the groups. And then you wait 6 months, and then you publish a paper in the JDE. And finally, the European Central Bank, when life gives you lemons, you should ask the Germans what to do. So this paper and some of the work that I've been doing, I like to think of as part of a renaissance in economics humor. Now, the idea of a renaissance in economics humor probably comes as a surprise to those of you who know that renaissance means rebirth, and had no idea that there was ever a first birth of economics humor. But in fact, there was. It was in the 70s and the early 80s. It included papers like Life Among the Econ by Axel Unpronounceable. This is a fake anthropology paper about the Econ tribe that lives in the bleak north. And they're actually divided up into these two sub-tribes, the micro and the macro. And they hate each other, and they don't get along, and they don't intermarry. And they actually have different totems. So for example, here's the totem of the micro tribe, which, as you can see, is totally different than the totem of the macro tribe. No wonder they don't get along. Another paper from this time period, The Theory of Interstellar Trade by Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on trade theory. He's also a big science fiction fan. And the premise of this paper is, if you had trade between solar systems, then presumably you would have spaceships that were traveling close to the speed of light. And so because of Einstein and special relativity, you wouldn't have time simultaneity. So the main question he looks at in this paper is, which clock should you use to calculate interest rates, the clocks on the planet or the clocks on the spaceship? Which, if you're into science fiction, is a terrific question, terrific paper. He notes that the article is a serious analysis of a ridiculous subject, which is, of course, the opposite of what is usual in economics. And he ends the paper by saying that those of us working in this field are still a small band, but we know that the force is with us. As the editor of the miscellaneous section for economic inquiry, I've published and received a number of humorous publications, or attempted humorous publications. Many of them fit under this category of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Here are some of the best ones. In the sex category, we have The Economics of Faking Ecstasy by Hugo Milan. In the drugs category, we have An Economic Theory of Workaholics and Alcoholics by Finkel and Shin, who note that alcohol diminishes performance, but may also lead individuals to reveal private information. So this is a contract theory paper. And the rock and roll element is put forward by this paper on the efficiency of AC/DC, Bon Scott versus Brian Johnson, which uses experimental economics to determine which of those two singers was the better frontman for the band AC/DC. In economic history, There's a classic paper by Preston McAfee, American Economic Growth and the Voyage of Columbus. This is a counterfactual analysis of what economic growth would have been like in North America if Columbus had fallen off the edge of the world. In finance, we have a paper from from Avinash Dixit called an option value paper from Seinfeld with the classic abstract, "This is a paper about nothing." Also in the finance world, we have this paper. This is actually a real economics paper. Until recently, Doug Elmendorf was the head of the Congressional Budget Office. The title of this paper is, "Can Financial Innovation Help to Explain the Reduced Volatility of Economic Activity?" A paper that was published in 2006, shortly before financial innovation led to the greatest increase in the volatility of economic activity since the Great Depression. You may think this bodes ill for the research that was done by these scholars, but in fact, it's okay. I have tracked down the abstract of this paper, and here's the abstract of this paper. No, it can't. I want to present a paper that has not been published. This is a paper called Hyperinflation in Hell that I was lucky enough to co-author with a veterinarian. Now, let me begin this paper by talking about hyperinflation on Earth. This is something that I think everybody here is familiar with. You know, you have Germany in between the world wars. Zimbabwe in 2008 had this massive bout of hyperinflation. Here's the $100 trillion Zimbabwe note, which you can buy on eBay for about 25 cents. Now, hyperinflation in hell is a new topic for economic research, and it actually runs counter to the conventional wisdom, which is that the economy of the afterworld is extremely stable. For example, there's no evidence that there are central bankers in hell. You can interpret that joke however you like. We actually show to the contrary that, in fact, there's chronic hyperinflation in the afterworld, and that it's driven by the same thing that drives hyperinflation here on Earth, namely a massive increase in the money supply, which I'm going to call M4, both to contrast it with the terrestrial measures M1, M2, and M3, and because in Mandarin the word for four sounds very much like the word for death. So what is driving this increase in the money supply is Joss paper. So here are some examples of Joss paper. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, Joss paper is part of certain Asian religious traditions where you burn fake money in order to send money to your ancestors in the afterworld. So the basic premise of our paper is population growth in Asia, economic growth in Asia, more people burning more fake money to send to their ancestors in the afterworld. What is this doing to the monetary base of the afterworld? A problem that has been exacerbated by a recent technological development, the Hell Banknote app for the iPhone, has been downloaded 10,000 times, including by me. It's kind of the dematerialization of dematerialization. And in kind of a very scary twist, not only can you send fake money to your ancestors, you can send them iPhones, which are presumably loaded with the app. Right? So very positive feedback. Okay. Now let's do the theory part. The theory is actually very simple, right? It sounds great that everybody can print as much money for their ancestors in the afterworld as they want. Right? It sounds terrific. It's a little bit like, you know, everybody gets to be a central banker. Like, what could possibly be wrong with that? But when you think about it for a minute, you realize it's kind of not as great as it sounds. You end up with a tragedy of the commons situation, where each individual is going to print more money for their ancestors in the afterworld than is socially optimal. Right? I mean, just imagine what would happen in the United States, for example, if everybody could print $100 bills instead of just, you know, the U.S. Treasury and the North Koreans. So that's kind of the theory. What about the empirical evidence, though? Now, you may think that it's difficult to do empirical work on the afterlife, but in fact, that difficulty is no contest when it comes up against the power of economic thinking. We have figured out a way to do empirical work on the afterworld, my co-author and I, and it involves the economic theory known as rational expectations, or sort of, you can kind of think about it as arbitrage as well. Let me give you an example about how this works. These three pieces of Joss paper, $1 million, £1 million, and 500 euro, all purchased by me in Beijing for the same amount of money here on Earth. Well, rational expectations should suggest that they should be worth the same amount of money in the afterworld, because otherwise, why would you buy the one that had lower value? In other words, the afterworld value of $1 million has got to be equal to the afterworld value of £1 million, which has got to be equal to the afterworld value of 500 euro. Now, the strength of the euro in the afterworld may surprise you, but I'm going to come back to that. Let me first note that none of this actually shows what any of these three pieces of joss paper are actually worth, but that's where this next piece of evidence comes from. These three pieces of joss paper, $50, $100, $1,000 joss paper notes, all in the same currency, all purchased by me in Beijing for the same amount of money here on Earth. They should be worth the same amount of money in the afterworld. In other words, we are looking for the variable x that solves the equation 50x equals 100x equals 1,000x. Now, I'm going to put the details in the mathematical appendix and cut to the punchline, which is that x has got to be equal to 0. In other words, we have empirical evidence that there has been a massive and total devaluation of the currency in the afterworld. Incidentally, this also explains the apparent strength of the euro. And it goes away when you multiply by 0. Now, this result actually leads to our policy recommendations. We think that there is an immediate and pressing need for necroeconomic reform. Because if we don't have necroeconomic reform, then terrible things will happen to non-living standards. You know how to measure non-living standards, right? With real GDP per d capita? Admit it, you love that joke. That's a good joke. So we actually think that the best solution, right, you could have a solution where you could try to have the faithful learn some economics. We looked at a solution where the Fed and other central banks could take over the underworld, right? They have swollen balance sheets, they could swallow them a little bit more. But I think really the ultimate solution is going to be dollarization. In other words, you could ban joss paper and require people who want to send money to their ancestors in the afterworld to burn actual currency, which we're confident will solve the problem of hyperinflation in the afterworld, as well as it has worked in places like Zimbabwe and Ecuador that now use the US dollar as their currency. Now, I have a brief epilogue to this paper, which is that my co-author and I actually submitted the paper to Economic Inquiry, a real economics journal. We did this because Economic Inquiry has a miscellany section for humorous articles. I know this because I am the editor of the miscellany section for Economic Inquiry, but I made a terrible mistake. The terrible mistake I made was that instead of saying, I am the editor of this section of the journal, I accept my own paper, I recused myself from the process and asked the editor-in-chief to referee the paper, to shepherd the paper through the referee process, which he did by sending the article to two referees who lacked a sense of humor. Here's what they wrote. Referee number 1 wrote, "The paper is funny as long as you are constrained to reading economics articles." Which is kind of damning with faint praise, but at least it makes sense. More sense than what referee number 2 wrote, which was, "The paper is entertaining in the sense the stand-up comedy routine is entertaining." I don't know, I think that should be pretty entertaining. In any case, the paper was rejected. And this is part of my catharsis, is to share with you the reasons why the referees rejected the paper. The referee concerns, the first referee wrote that the paper lacks a dynamic post-mortem general equilibrium model, without which it could not be published. The second referee wrote something that still boggles my mind. The second referee wrote, "The paper makes the mistaken assumption that there is no technological progress in the afterlife. Why would the dead suddenly lose their capacity to innovate?" I don't know, maybe it's because they're dead. Referee number 2 also added a P.S., where is the promised mathematical appendix? All of this reminds me of a poem by David Pennell, which I will close with today. You can find the full poem on the internet, but on my website, in fact, standupeconomist.com, I have a compendium of economics humor. Here's the last verse of the poem. "I used to be a psychopath, but never more will be. I can deal with my frustrations now that I'm a referee." I want to close by mentioning I have a couple of these cartoon economics books, which I encourage you to check out on my website, standupeconomist.com. Also a cartoon book about climate change, and coming up next, my co-author and I are working on a cartoon introduction to calculus. So thank you very much.